Welcome to the Worm Cozy Blanket channel. Today, I'm going to whisper you a new creepy and fantastically cozy story. To be honest, I fall asleep to them myself. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like my work. Now make yourself comfortable. I'm going to start reading. The Hollow Echo. Chapter 1. The Quiet Town. Mayfield was the kind of town that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a postcard. Nestled in the heart of America's Midwest, it boasted picturesque streets lined with maple trees, whose leaves turned fiery shades of orange and red come autumn. The houses were modest but well kept, their white picket fences standing as silent sentinels to the quiet lives unfolding behind them. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, not because they were nosy, but because life moved at such a slow pace that there wasn't much else to talk about. For 30-year-old Clara Bennett, Mayfield was both sanctuary and prison. She had grown up here, one of those kids who dreamed of escaping the small-town bubble for something bigger, brighter, more exciting. But when her mother fell ill 5 years ago, Clara dropped out of college and returned home to care for her. Now, with her mom gone and no real ties left except the diner where she worked 6 days a week, Clara found herself stuck like gum on the sole of an old shoe, clinging stubbornly to the same spot despite all attempts to scrape free. Clara's routine rarely varied. Every morning, she woke just before dawn, brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and walked the 10 blocks from her tiny apartment to Rosie's diner. The diner was a relic of another era, its neon sign flickering faintly even during daylight hours. Inside, the vinyl booths were cracked, the formica tables scratched, and the air carried the faint aroma of grease mingled with stale cigarette smoke. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and truthfully, Clara liked the predictability of it. The customers were regulars, their orders memorized by heart. Old Mr. Henderson always wanted his eggs over easy. Mrs. Larson never skipped dessert, no matter how many times her husband scolded her. Even the occasional truckers passing through seemed harmless enough, tipping generously if you smiled wide enough. But lately, something felt off. Not dramatically so, not in a way that anyone else would notice. It was subtle, like the hum of electricity running beneath the surface of everything. For weeks now, Clara had noticed strange things, a shadow moving across the corner of her vision when she glanced out the window, the sound of footsteps echoing down empty hallways late at night. At first, she chalked it up to exhaustion or stress. After all, working double shifts could play tricks on your mind. But then came the dreams. They started innocuously enough, fragments of memory slipping into her sleep. A child laughing in the distance, the scent of rain-soaked earth, a voice calling her name, soft and insistent, though she couldn't make out the words. As the nights wore on, the dreams grew sharper, more vivid. One recurring image haunted her above all others, a dark doorway standing alone in the middle of a field, its edges blurred as though painted onto foggy glass. each time she approached it in her dream, the pull became stronger, almost magnetic, until she woke gasping for air, her sheets tangled around her legs. Clara tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just fatigue catching up with her. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was watching her, waiting. And though she couldn't explain why, she felt certain that whatever it wasn't human. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Walls. The first time Clara heard the whispers, she was closing up the diner after a particularly grueling shift. The clock above the counter read 11:47 p.m., and the only sounds were the clink of dishes being stacked and the low hum of the refrigerator compressors kicking on. She had just finished wiping down the last table when a faint murmur reached her ears. It was so soft she might have dismissed it as the wind rustling outside, if not for the fact that the windows were shut tight against the biting October chill. Clara froze, her rag dangling limply in her hand. "Hello," she called out, her voice cutting sharply through the silence. No response, just the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the distant rumble of a car engine fatting into the night. She shook her head, chiding herself for being jumpy. Still, the unease lingered. As she locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was lingering just beyond the edge of perception. By the time she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, distorting the shapes of parked cars and empty storefronts. Everything looked normal, yet the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It wasn't until she reached her apartment building that the whispers returned. This time, they weren't muffled or indistinct. They were sharp, urgent, and unmistakably close. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, her key trembling in the lock. The voices overlapped, too fast to decipher, but one phrase repeated itself over and over again. "Come closer." Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "Who's there?" she demanded, spinning around to face the empty sidewalk behind her. There was no one, just the skeletal branches of the oak tree swaying gently in the breeze, and the faint glow of her neighbor's porch light spilling onto the curb. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. Maybe she was losing her mind. Maybe the stress of working endless hours and living alone in this godforsaken town had finally caught up with her. Whatever it was, she decided right then and there that she needed answers. The next day, Clara arrived at the diner earlier than usual, determined to find some semblance of normalcy. Her coworker, Betty, greeted her with a sympathetic smile. Betty was in her 50s, with dyed red hair and a penchant for gossip. She'd taken Clara under her wing when she first started working at Rosie, offering advice on everything from customer service to dealing with unruly drunks. "You look tired, honey," Betty said, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of Clara. "Rough night." Clara hesitated, unsure whether to confide in her. Betty meant well, but she also had a reputation for spreading stories faster than wildfire. Still, the weight pressing down on Clara's shoulders made her desperate for relief. "I've been hearing things," she admitted quietly, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Voices, late at night. I don't know what to make of it." Betty raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Voices, huh? You sure you haven't been sneaking shots of whiskey during closing time?" Clara managed a weak laugh. "No, nothing like that. It's hard to explain, like whispers, but not from anyone around me. More like," she trailed off, searching for the right words, "like they're coming from inside the walls." Betty's expression shifted from playful skepticism to genuine concern. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You ever hear about the old mill on the outskirts of town? Folks say it's haunted. Some claim they've seen lights flickering in the windows, even though the place has been abandoned for decades." Clara frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Betty shrugged. "Just saying, weird stuff happens around here sometimes. People get spooked, especially this time of year. Halloween's coming up, after all. Could be your imagination playing tricks on you." But Clara wasn't convinced. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Closer. They formed words she couldn't quite understand, a language that sounded ancient and foreign, yet somehow familiar. Her pulse quickened as she realized the source of the sound wasn't external, it was emanating from within her own mind. Desperate for distraction, she grabbed her phone and opened the Notes app. Typing furiously, she began jotting down everything she remembered from her dreams: the dark doorway, the laughter, the rain-soaked earth. The act of writing calmed her nerves, grounding her in reality. But as she scrolled through her notes, a pattern emerged, one she hadn't noticed before. Each description included references to a specific location: the woods behind the high school. Growing up, Clara and her friends used to dare each other to venture into those woods after dark, claiming they were cursed. Back then, she'd laughed it off as silly superstition. Now, she wasn't so sure. The following evening, armed with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, Clara drove to the edge of the forest. The trees loomed ominously against the twilight sky, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. What was she doing? Chasing ghosts, listening to voices in her head. And yet, something compelled her forward, something primal and unyielding. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and plunged into the darkness. Chapter 3: The Doorway. The woods swallowed Clara whole, wrapping her in a cocoon of shadows and whispers. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating gnarled roots and patches of moss-covered rocks. The air smelled damp and earthy, tinged with the faint metallic tang of decay. Every step crunched softly underfoot, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Despite the chill seeping through her jacket, beads of sweat trickled down her spine. As she ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, weaving together into a cacophony that pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. They weren't random anymore, they were guiding her, pulling her inexorably towards something. Clara's chest tightened, but she pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The rational part of her brain screamed to turn back, to flee while she still could, but it was drowned out by the relentless tug in her gut. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, she stumbled into a clearing. And there it was, the doorway. It stood exactly as she'd seen it in her dreams. Tall, weathered, and impossibly solid, carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Its edges shimmered faintly, as though viewed through a heat haze, and intricate carvings adorned its surface, symbols that resembled nothing she'd ever seen before. They writhed subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if alive. Clara's breath hitched. She took a hesitant step forward, her boots crunching audibly on the forest floor. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, soft and coaxing. "Open it." Her hand hovered inches from the doorframe, trembling. Logic warred with instinct. This was madness. Doors didn't just appear in the middle of nowhere. Yet, every fiber of her being screamed that this was real, that this was why she'd been drawn here, why the dreams had plagued her for weeks. Before she could second-guess herself, Clara pushed the door open. A rush of icy wind slammed into her, carrying with it a stench so foul it made her gag. The world beyond the threshold was a swirling void of blackness, punctuated by flashes of crimson lightning. Shapes moved within the chaos, twisted, grotesque figures that seemed to writhe and contort in agony. Their cries echoed in her ears, blending with the whispers until they became a deafening roar. Clara staggered backward, clutching her head. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. Then, amidst the cacophony, a new sound emerged: laughter. High-pitched and gleeful, it sent shivers racing down her spine. It sounded like a child's laugh, innocent and carefree, but warped into something sinister. "Hello," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the din. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it felt unnatural. Slowly, the swirling vortex began to recede, revealing a figure standing just beyond the doorway. At first glance, it appeared human, a young boy, no older than 10, dressed in tattered clothes. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. He tilted his head, studying her with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and malice. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "But now that you're here," he didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he extended a hand, palm up, as though inviting her to take it. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a combination of terror and fascination. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The boy smiled a wide, toothy grin that revealed rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "I'm what waits," he replied cryptically. "And you've been waiting for me too, haven't you?" Clara's mind raced. Was this some kind of hallucination? A manifestation of her subconscious fears brought to life? Or was it something far worse, something ancient and incomprehensible? "I don't understand," she stammered. "What do you want from me?" The boy's smile widened, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. "To show you the truth," he said simply. "To bring you home." With that, he lunged forward, faster than should have been possible. Clara screamed, stumbling backward as the boy vanished into thin air. Behind her, the doorway slammed shut with a deafening boom, leaving her alone in the clearing once more. Gasping for breath, Clara scrambled to her feet and bolted back toward her car. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, each step fueled by sheer adrenaline. She didn't stop running until she collapsed onto the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she sped away from the woods, one thought kept repeating itself in her mind. What did I just see? Chapter 4, Shadows in the Light. Back in the safety of her apartment, Clara sat hunched over her kitchen table, staring blankly at the notes she'd scribbled earlier. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a broken record, each detail etched into her consciousness with excruciating clarity. The boy's glowing eyes, his jagged teeth, the way the ground had trembled beneath her feet. It was impossible, irrational, utterly insane. And yet, she couldn't deny what she'd experienced. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. Glancing down, she saw a text from Betty. "Hey, girl, how you holding up? You sounded pretty freaked yesterday." Clara hesitated before replying. Part of her wanted to confide in someone, to share the burden weighing heavily on her shoulders. But how could she explain what had happened without sounding like a lunatic? Reluctantly, she typed out a vague response. "Still figuring things out. Thanks for checking in." Setting the phone aside, she returned her attention to her notes. Something about the symbols carved into the doorway nagged at her. They reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. On impulse, she grabbed her laptop and began searching online for images of ancient runes or occult symbols. Hours passed as she scrolled through page after page, her frustration mounting with each dead end. Finally, she stumbled upon a grainy photograph of a stone tablet unearthed during an archaeological dig in Eastern Europe. The symbols etched into the stone bore a striking resemblance to those on the doorway. According to the article, the tablet dated back thousands of years and was believed to belong to a long-lost civilization obsessed with interdimensional travel. Scholars speculated that the symbols served as a map or key of sorts, designed to guide individuals between realms. Clara's blood ran cold. If the doorway truly led somewhere else, somewhere beyond the boundaries of reality, then the implications were staggering and terrifying. Her research led her to a local library the next morning. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whittaker, greeted her warmly. "Looking for anything in particular, dear?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "I'm trying to learn more about Mayfield's history," Clara lied smoothly. "Anything unusual or supernatural?" Mrs. Whittaker chuckled. "Oh, we've got plenty of ghost stories, if that's what you're after. Most are nonsense, of course, but there's one tale that always gives me chills." Intrigued, Clara leaned forward. "What's that?" "It's about the old mill," Mrs. Whittaker explained, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "People say it was built on cursed land. Back in the 1800s, settlers reported seeing strange lights in the woods nearby. Some claimed to hear voices calling to them in the dead of night. A few even disappeared without a trace. Eventually, the townsfolk burned the mill to the ground, hoping to break the curse. Clara's stomach churned. "Do you think any of it's true?" Mrs. Whittaker shrugged. "Who knows? But I will tell you this. Bad things happen when people go poking around in places they don't belong." That evening, unable to resist the pull of the unknown, Clara returned to the woods. This time, she brought a camera, determined to document everything. When she reached the clearing, however, the doorway was gone. In its place stood a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred and gnarled. Confusion washed over her as she circled the area, searching for any sign of the mysterious portal. Had she imagined it all along? Frustrated, she snapped a few photos of the tree before heading home. It wasn't until later, while reviewing the pictures on her computer, that she noticed something peculiar. In one shot, the tree's bark appeared to ripple slightly, as though disturbed by an unseen force. Enlarging the image, she discovered faint outlines of the same symbols she'd seen on the doorway, barely visible beneath the surface. Her heart sank. Whatever she was dealing with, it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 5, The Choice. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself caught in a surreal limbo. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, urging her to return to the woods. Sleep eluded her, replaced by restless nights filled with fragmented dreams of the boy and the doorway. During the day, she went through the motions of her routine, serving coffee, washing dishes, exchanging pleasantries with customers. But her mind was elsewhere, consumed by questions she couldn't answer. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter at Rosie, a man entered the diner. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. His presence was unsettling, though she couldn't pinpoint why. He slid onto a stool at the bar and ordered a black coffee, his voice smooth and measured. "You're Clara, aren't you?" he asked casually, sipping his drink. She stiffened, forcing a polite smile. "Yeah, do I know you?" He shook his head. "Not personally, but I've heard about you, about what you've seen." Her pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" The man leaned in closer, his gaze unwavering. "The doorway, the boy, the whispers. Don't look so surprised. I've been watching you." Fear and anger surged within her. "Who are you?" "My name is Elias," he said simply. "And I'm here to help you. Whether you believe me or not, you've stumbled into something far bigger than yourself, something dangerous. Clara's grip tightened on the rag in her hand. Why should I trust you? Elias sighed, leaning back slightly. Because I know what's waiting for you if you don't listen. That boy, the one you met, he's not human. Neither are the others. They're remnants of a world that existed long before ours, trapped between dimensions. And they've chosen you for a reason. For what? She demanded, her voice trembling. To open the door fully, Elias replied grimly. To let them cross over. A chill ran down her spine. How do you know all this? I've spent my life studying these things, he said. Tracking patterns, piecing together clues. I can teach you how to fight them, how to protect yourself. But it won't be easy. Clara hesitated, torn between disbelief and desperation. Could she really trust this stranger? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle, sent to confuse her further? I need proof, she said finally. Something tangible. Elias nodded, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Flipping it open, he pointed to a series of sketches and diagrams. These are the same symbols you described. They appear in texts dating back centuries, always linked to accounts of disappearances and hauntings. If you'll let me, I can show you how to use them against whatever's haunting you. For a moment, Clara considered refusing. But deep down, she knew she couldn't face this alone. Fine, she said quietly. But if you're lying to me, I'm not, Elias interrupted firmly. And I promise you won't regret trusting me. Over the next several days, Elias guided Clara through a crash course in self-defense and ritualistic protection. They practiced drawing warding sigils, reciting incantations, and channeling energy to repel malevolent forces. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but Clara felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Then one night, the whispers returned with a vengeance. They echoed through her apartment, louder and clearer than ever before. It's time, they hissed. Come back to us. Heart pounding, Clara grabbed the supplies Elias had given her, a pouch of salt, a vial of holy water, and a dagger engraved with protective runes, and raced back to the woods. When she arrived at the clearing, the doorway stood waiting, its surface pulsating with an eerie light. The boy appeared almost immediately, his grin wider and more menacing than before. You can't stop it, he taunted. It's already begun. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara traced a circle of salt around herself and began chanting the words Elias had taught her. The air crackled with energy, and the boy recoiled, his form flickering like static on an old television screen. You think you're strong enough, he snarled, lunging toward her. Clara raised the dagger, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. I'm not afraid of you anymore. With a final, desperate cry, she plunged the dagger into the ground, completing the ritual. A blinding flash of light erupted, engulfing the clearing. When it faded, the doorway was gone, and so was the boy. Breathing heavily, Clara collapsed to her knees. She had won for now. But as she stared at the empty space where the doorway had been, a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if sealing the door hadn't banished the boy? What if it had merely delayed the inevitable? Chapter 6, an open ending. Weeks passed, and life in Mayfield returned to its usual rhythm, or at least, it seemed that way on the surface. Clara resumed her shifts at the diner, smiling politely at customers and exchanging idle chatter with Betty. To the casual observer, she appeared normal, even content. But beneath the veneer of routine, she remained vigilant, acutely aware of the fragile boundary between her world and the one she'd glimpsed beyond the doorway. Elias had disappeared shortly after the confrontation in the woods, leaving behind only a cryptic note. Stay alert. This isn't over. Clara hadn't seen or heard from him since, though she often wondered if he was still watching, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. His absence left her feeling oddly bereft, as though she'd lost a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. The whispers, too, had grown quieter, but not entirely silent. They lingered at the edges of her awareness, faint murmurs that prickled her skin whenever she let her guard down. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she could feel eyes on her, watching from the shadows. Other times, she'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Despite her efforts to move forward, the memory of the boy haunted her. His glowing eyes and jagged grin invaded her dreams, twisting them into nightmares that left her drenched in sweat and gasping for air. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, biding his time, plotting his return. One crisp November morning, as Clara unlocked the diner's front door, she noticed something unusual etched into the glass. A single symbol, identical to those carved into the doorway. Her breath hitched, and she quickly wiped it away with her sleeve, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The street was empty, save for a stray cat darting across the road. Inside, she busied herself with preparations, trying to push the incident from her mind. But as the day wore on, more anomalies began to surface. A customer complained of hearing faint laughter emanating from the kitchen, even though no one was back there. Another claimed to see a child's reflection in the mirror behind the counter, though Clara saw nothing when she checked. Each occurrence was minor, easily dismissed as coincidence or paranoia, but collectively, they weighed heavily on her psyche. By the time her shift ended, Clara was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As she locked up and stepped outside, she paused, her gaze drawn to the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she wasn't tethered to this town, this diner, this endless cycle of dread. But then a sound broke the spell, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. "We're waiting." Clara froze, her heart hammering wildly. Slowly, she turned, scanning the deserted street. Nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Yet the message was clear. They weren't done with her. As she walked home, the question gnawed at her. What would happen next? Would she spend the rest of her days looking over her shoulder, bracing for the moment the boy, or something worse, returned? Or was there a way to sever the connection permanently, to reclaim her life and banish the shadows for good? The truth was, she didn't know. And perhaps that uncertainty was the most terrifying part of all. Reaching her apartment, Clara hesitated before unlocking the door. Her hand hovered over the knob, trembling slightly. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual, charged with an almost electric tension. She stepped cautiously into the living room, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. On the coffee table lay a single object, a small wooden carving of a doorway. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. It was warm to the touch, as though it had been sitting in sunlight for hours. Turning it over in her hands, she noticed tiny scratches along the sides, symbols, barely visible but unmistakably familiar. Her mind raced. Was this a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? Before she could decide, the room grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The whispers returned, louder this time, forming words that sent a shiver down her spine. The door will open again. Clara clenched the carving tightly, her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she would face it. Because running hadn't worked. Ignoring it hadn't worked. And now, she had no choice but to fight. But as she stood there, surrounded by darkness, one thought lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. What if the door opening again wasn't the worst thing that could happen? What if it was the only way to find out who, or what she truly was?